So before I start this video, I'm gonna make a full disclosure. So you see that my horns here are a little bit of a different color, and I go through the video and talk about how I made those using these horns. It turns out that my kit actually had everything I needed, and if you order your kit from FlySafeJets, you're gonna get these horns, 2 of them, and those are for the rudder. So these guys are supposed to go here and here. So as you watch the video of me working on my vertical stabs and rudders, just remember that these, which I actually used to make these guys, these are actually what should have gone here and here. So let's talk vertical fins that house the rudders. So on my FlySafeJets F35, the hinge design is a little bit different. I guess this is a live hinge. You can see that on the one side you have the hinge, and it's just Kevlar or whatever they use, and not actual hinges. So the hardware package of the jet comes with these hinges right here, and I guess you can use those, and then if you do it that way, if you follow the DerJet manual, there's sort of a carbon rod that comes out the bottom here, and you attach your servo to that, your servo linkage. So for this, I'm just going off of what the FlySafeJets rep recommended, which is that we just have that servo come from the outside and go into the actual control surface. Now, what I did is I'm just going to mount it externally, and I made this slit here, and that slit is so that it can accommodate the metal arm that I'm trying to use, that you can see in there with the M3 bolt that goes through it. And the slit here is about, let's see, the slit's about almost 50 millimeters by about 8, and that'll depend just based on what control horn you'll use. But basically the point is, it literally, in my case, there is a sort of line on the vertical stab right around here. So basically I just cut from there up about 8 millimeters. And if you see where this is, base position on the servo, there's also another sort of panel line right here that lines up pretty well with the top. So 8 from this bottom panel line, 8 millimeters up, and then from this panel line here, about 50 millimeters back. And that gives me, with my free wing exact servo, which is what I'm using. I'm using the 5301. The manual calls for a servo that's got at least 4.5 kilos. These guys are 6 kilos HV, and I'm going to be using them on 8.4 volts. So that's what's going to happen. What I did is I went ahead and bought a G10 piece of fiberglass from Amazon, but I just traced that out, and I'm going to cut that and make 2 of them, and that's what's going to be used on the rudder. So 10 minutes later, we have our new set of hinges right here. So I'm just going to measure, make sure I get my geometry correct, and I'm going to install that hinge. So it's probably just going to sit as close as possible to this edge right here. So back on the rudder here. So I'm getting ready to glue this. I've found and aligned my linkage pretty well, and so the only change I made to the horn is that I sanded sort of the bottom, and you can see the difference there, and dropped in some holes. The idea there is that I want the epoxy to really have something to grab on to, and I have also put tape around here, so that way I know that I'm gluing the entire surface, and that way when this goes in place, I should be able to get a nice clean epoxy joint all around that. So I'm working on the elevators right now, and or stabilators, and I have my hardware package, and in here there are 4 of these L brackets, and these are what are going to be used to mount the servos onto the elevators. And per the manual, it looks like they're going to go like that, and then this is going to be screwed down into the wood on both sides. These threads in here, they are tapped for an M3 screw, so that's what I'm going to use, M3, to secure these guys down, and then I'll show you how that fits into the elevator. For the servo, I chose to be using the BLS 893 from GDW. These are pretty fast servos. I've used them before. I like them. The manual calls for at least a 20 kilogram servo. This guy is a 36 kilogram, so it's what I had lying around. That's what I'm going to use. Okay, so always remember that when attaching these brackets, because this is metal to metal, I'm going to use just a little bit of Loctite. And in my case, I'm going to be using these M3 by 8 millimeter screws. And so we got to get our blue Loctite on here, just a nice good amount, and then we can secure that onto the servo. So don't skip the Loctite, at least I don't, because we want that servo to be secured in place well enough. According to the manual, it looks like the pictures there show the servo laid down sort of like that, with this facing sort of the front of the fuselage and this side facing the back. So I'm going to install these. I have them both prepared. You can see them here, and we'll go from there. So we are at the back of the F35, and one of the things I noticed is the way the servo wants to sit per the manual is sort of like that. So this is the front of the jet, this is the back, and this drops into this sort of cavity here. But what I noticed is, because of the exact shape of this, the screws that hold the servo onto the mount have to be flush with the back. Otherwise you have to get a Dremel and clear up some of the wood. So I went back and changed those M3s from 8 millimeters to 6, and they are perfectly flush. And then so what happens is this is going to drop here in sort of like that. So I found out a couple of things which I'm going to share now. Number one, if you see here, there was a shape that was cut in this bulkhead, and I trimmed a little too much because I wanted the cable to be able to get through, but I actually don't think that was necessary, so I would just leave that as is. I had to repair mine because I over trimmed it, and what happens is that is where one of the holes actually needs to be screwed down. The second thing is, I had thought that the servos would go in here with sort of the spline towards the front of the fuselage, but looking at my packing slip, I see that they packed aluminum servo mount set for elevator, and there's 4 of those. And I looked in my hardware kit and I found these guys, so that those 4 of these included in there. Come on, focus. And so with those, and there was 2 of these rods, and so when I put these in here to sort of try and mock up what the setup would be, I found that, and even if I put this sort of level and stick it in there, you see that the spline actually has to be closer to the back of the fuselage than the front. So what that means is it's gonna have to go, the servo's gonna have to go in like this. So here is the Stabilator with the horn mounted. So you can see that I just took a carbon fiber tube and put it around the horn. The horn, it's the control arm. The linkage itself is pretty heavy duty, but just to add more and make it more aesthetically pleasing, I added that. And the other thing I want to mention is in here is this is an M3 screw and an M3 lock nut on this end. And in there, all I did is, if you look at this linkage, there's a side of it that has like a ball bearing, and there's a side that doesn't have, it's kind of flat. So all I did is I used a one washer in here, and you can see it right there. on the side that doesn't have sort of the exposed, the metal bearing looking like that. And so that's an M3 washer, and I use that and just screw that in there tight enough. It doesn't need to be too tight, it just needs to not have too much play, but it needs to be able to move. So with that linkage in here, I'm gonna slot it into the into its spot over here, mount the servo, and make sure that everything, geometry and travel, works. So we have inserted the stabilator in place, and you can see that linkage is in here, and that's why it looks like the servo needs to sit with the spline or the servo horn towards the back of the aircraft. So just checking the movement here, it feels pretty smooth. Obviously, so I had to trim this because the control linkage was rubbing against it and creating some friction, but this feels pretty free, and you can see that linkage is moving in there without friction. So we inserted our pin that goes from one end all the way through the two arms that are in here to hold the elevator or stabilator in place, and that just sits there. I think that should be fine. There's no reason for that to pull out. There's not too much vibration, and it's pretty hard to actually pull that out. So we're gonna go mount the servo and check that everything works. So I'm ready to mount my servos, and what I'm using are these RTL fasteners number 3x5/8, and they are fairly long screws. What I like is that they have an Allen head at the top, which fits my 2.5mm 2.0 Allen wrench. So we're gonna use those. I already drilled a small hole, and we're gonna just secure those in place. And one of the things I'm liking about this jet is that the tolerances are pretty tight. What I mean by that is the servo fits just exactly. If you look at this linkage here, let's zoom out, move the camera so we can see. If you look at this linkage here, the geometry, if you set the servo just right, the geometry is perfect. Like from the servo to the control surface, it's completely straight. So that's awesome. So I haven't tightened this here, just trying to get a loose fit. Once that's done, we'll tighten it, and then we'll move the surface, check that everything works as expected, and we're good to go. So the servo is in place, and I'll just make a couple of notes here. So the first is that when I secured this M3 bolt to the horn, I just used 2 M3 washers on either side of this aluminum linkage here. So you can see one sort of right there, the other one is just right behind this, between this guy and this red servo horn. And that's just to make sure that I got, I don't tighten this too much, or there's no binding and that kind of stuff, so that, you know, just to be safe. So I added that in there, secured the 4 RTL fastener screws, and now the servo is in place, and I really like how this is moving. It's fairly free. Let's zoom out here so we can see. The movement is very free, and it feels like these servos or these elevators have no slop at all. We have power to the servo, and that is moving just fine. This jet has more throw in the up than the low direction, so that's to be expected. There's no binding. There's very little to no slop in that surface. Wow, that is rock solid. So now that my elevators are mounted and everything, I can put together the back end. And so what I did in here is, in the bulkheads inside, the space to run your wires is actually on the bottom shelf. So the shelf that the servos sit on, below it. And so what I had to do here is, I made this cut much bigger. That cut used to be just a circle, but by doing that, what I can do now is I have access to push my finger in, because the rudder servo, the wire, the lead is gonna go just behind the elevator servo, as you can see there. And by doing it that way, then yeah, it goes right behind the servo there. By doing it that way, it gets access to where there's room to actually run that wire forward. So once we have that in place, I'm gonna slot the vertical stab, and these are tapped M3 on the bottom. So we're gonna use a M3 and washers. These are all provided in your hardware kit to secure that in place, and then repeat this process on the other side. So on the bottom side of the jet, this is the side in which we put the rudder in earlier. There are two holes. So there's one right here, and there's one right here. So this is where your M3 screws will go through. But before you do that, you have to put a washer to actually provide, surface area for that bolt to sit on. And that goes in here and in here. We'll do that and then come back. The hardware kit, there are these M3 screws, and these are, let's see, there are about total length is about 20 millimeters, and the thread is about 19 millimeters. There are also two sets of washers in here, so you've got sort of a small one, and these are the M3, and you've got a big one, these are I think M4, so these are the ones we're going to use, and you'll see that that fits really well, whereas this one, it's kind of loose and the head almost feels like it might poke through, so that's not the one you want to use. You want to use two of these screws and washer for each rudder, and those go in that hole there and the one in the back. Forget your Loctite, because this is metal going into metal. And just like that, the rudder is installed. So Loctite on the tip of this, or in the standoff, the M3, and that gets there tightened, as well as in this side. Once we're done with the screws that secure the rudder on both sides, and those get secured by a 2.5 millimeter wrench. My son has left the room. So I was saying, these, once you're done securing these with a 2.5 millimeter wrench, and it works well if you can actually get the kind that is sort of rounded and has a piece of cloth at the tip to hold that while you stick it in place. Once that's done, put the cover plates back on, because I can access these wires from in here, so I'm just gonna route them, and then we're gonna cover up this hatch, and I'll be able to access these wires from inside the fuselage. And this is pretty straightforward. You get your hatch covers, and we just screw them in place with the screws that were provided in the kit. And some of them actually have paint, so you know which goes where. And just like that, sticking the servos into the rudders and the stabilators or elevators is done. We're going to repeat on the other side, and we're pretty much done with the control surface servo mounting.